on our platform that we're going to talk about today. But let's talk about the recent Supreme Court decisions and its impact on America. In particular, let's talk first about the Supreme Court decisions on the transgender athletes. And yes, sir. And I know you have some thoughts regarding that. And some,
Well,
so
we know that the
yes,
Supreme Court upheld state legislation that banned trans females from participating in female sports. And so that is a setback for advocates of transgender uh, participation. It's a very controversial decision because you have the issue of inclusion on one hand versus either the reality or the perception of fair competition. So on one hand, folk are saying that we need to be more inclusive about our definition of females and transgender females should be included. On the other hand, I believe that the perception or the reality, I'm not specifically know about the science, is that a lot of people perceive that the reason why they don't want to have it because they see it as violating fair competition. Not so much because of the hormones, such things like bone density and other things that would give trans females an advantage.
now, before we move onward, it, part and parcel to the fundamental issue is the equal protection of this category of individuals, and that they feel as though that their rights are being trampled upon, and that you want individuals to be treated fairly. And what does that say to you about the fairness?
Well, once again, in terms of
Yes, sir.
fair, I was speaking of inclusion as the more fundamental
Okay.
issue, but in terms of fairness, uh, on one hand, it's saying it's unfair for transgender females not to be included. On the other hand, those who either in believe that the science or also believe that the public perception is that including trans female into the competition is unfair competition.
Yes.
So that's the point I was making. Now, with so at any rate, I think the public opinion and public perception may be in the favor of those who are against them competing, because it's a situation where we've just seen politically how the MAGA party, the Republican Party, has used the idea of transgender to take advantage of political gains, outside of California, outside of, more in red states and other states. They've used that to their advantage.
Yes, sir. And as we move forward, birthright citizenship, big issue. If you're born in the United States, or you have a right to become, you have a right to be considered an American citizen. And that's the issue now that we know that, and I know everyone, our listeners have been paying attention to this, that it is an issue which is comprehensively. We think that is many of us believe that it's not a major issue, but address that from a political science position.
Well,
Yes,
from
sir.
a political science perspective, this is, to me,
Yes, sir.
this is the most of the decisions. They made a decision on mail-in voting. They made the decision on boards and commissions. But this is the most important and significant decision that has been made, because this has to do with who the very change and future of the composition of the United States of America. We know for a long time, particularly with other race folk, both in terms of African Americans, Native Americans, and then every other person of color, a group of color, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Filipinos, Chinese. They've all over time had to be included into the definition of citizenship, even after the 14th Amendment, which was primarily developed for former enslaved people. So this is a very significant in terms of this idea of replacement theory and the idea of the fear of genetic annihilation and every other projection that the minority is going to be the majority. So the strategy is to say certain people cannot be citizens, and that the composition, in my opinion, I believe it's an attack at the composition of the United States in the future. So this decision supporting the birth citizenship is very significant to that argument.
Well, the contention by this president and his cadre of supporters is that it was meant solely for slaves, for slaves and slaves only, and therefore, when you understand that, and not to be used for other groups, so therefore, you should not have anchor babies. Folks come into the United States and have just to have a child, and then have the child then leave, and have the child become a U.S. citizen. And individuals come from Europe, individuals come from Eastern Europe and other parts of the world, and have their kids. And better yet, this president has indicated that you have individuals who come from Central and Latin America. They come across the border. Once they come from across the border in undocumented status, then have kids here, who kids become automatic American citizens.
Well, how did we handle that in the past? Were we so concerned about Europeans who applied the anchor principle? I mean, that's why the birthright citizenship criteria is the way it is, because you can't really cut the baby in half. You know, at the end game, I believe, of the mega party and others is that they want to define who the population is going to be, and they don't like the trend that the people who are coming in that are having babies and the birth rate for Europeans and others are low. I think at the end game is what will the complexion of the United States be? All these other arguments about anchor babies, sure, you know, there's a reason to set limits if you so choose. If you look at some of the criteria, maybe let in certain amounts at certain times. But I think when you pick and choose and say that these set of the people from South Africa that were invited in to come, they are not even birthright citizens.
They were white South Africans.
They were white. So I think to me, it's a game that they're playing, and the end game is to make sure that the population of the United States now and in the future is basically a larger percentage of European people from European descent.
To slow down the browning and darkening of America.
Absolutely.
And to keep it Eurocentric.
So the fact that this court, in a 6-3 decision, supported this is very significant, because I believe they supported it because of the fact that what other criteria you're going to use? You've let people in the past. Are we making the assumption that anchor baby is a new concept, that it's only restricted from people from Latin countries? I don't. There've been Latin other Europeans who've come in the past who've had anchor babies. So, the motivation to me is what we have to look at. And so this was a very, very significant decision that will determine the changes and the future population of the United States.
Before we move on and talk about some other issues of importance, I would like for you to just talk about the essence and nature of this Supreme Court.
Well, let me
Yes.
just quickly talk about two other decisions. The mail-in ballot voting was very significant because we know
Again, yeah.
the control of elections, the management of elections is with the state. And so now you have saying mail-in, but though there are some states in which that's all they do. And unless there's some evidence of widespread corruption, that was a good decision as well. But the other decision, and I don't know, you mentioned
The boards, you mentioned the president's control of independent boards.
That's very interesting. Well, let me set the background for this.
All right.
The Federalist Society, conservative group, has theorized and developed a plan over years about having a conservative view of the executive branch, in which they view the unitary executive authority almost in the same view that they look at monarchy. So in terms as it relates to the presidency and the executive branch, their view is that you have to have a strong executive branch, and thereby executive branches should have control over all boards and commissions, independent boards and commissions. So that, but that's that. Previously what was happening is, we thought that it was necessary for it to be independent. The impact is unbelievable because you're talking about the Federal Trade Commission, you're talking about the National Labor Relations Board. So you're talking about major policy areas in which, the broadcasting, in which the president now will be able to dictate and fire who's on there. And the reason why it's being done is because of the view of the presidency. You got to watch these things because that view is being taken because of the president, the MAGAs are in power. It's amazing when they are not in power, all of a sudden they criticize President Obama for using the term czar, and other kinds of things. So, what you find is from the court standpoint, and we've always said that the conservative court applies judicial restraint, and that meaning that they don't try to make policy from the bench. And we said that the liberals and conservatives always apply, judicial activism. In other words, they tried to make, the Warren Court was viewed in that vein. But now we see that the conservative court is more judicially active than the Warren Court ever could be. They're intervening in every decision that comes along. They're making policy, and that policy is made in line with the ideology of the Federalist Society and the ideology of the mega conservatives. So that's what's going on now, that the court is political. Even though they may have a legal rationale for what they're doing, they're basically trying to fulfill an ideological mandate.
Well, and I agree with you 100%. The rationale is this. They engage in a political policy.
Right.
And once they engage in the political policy and political directive, they try and give it a legal
spin to it.
To give it some support, now, however bad the legal spin may be.
But let me say this. There was one decision that was not consistent with maintaining the independence, and that is the appointments to the Federal Reserve. In that particular case, they ruled against the Trump administration because once again, it has to do with the economy. And they don't want, he might be a monarchy, but they don't think he knows anything about running an economy. When you talk about changing interest rates, the supply of money, and all of those kind of things, that is an independent decision. You need people, that's why we just had the death of Alan Greenspan. That's what he's known for. regulating the interest rates in such a way as to address the problem of inflation, and not so much concern about unemployment, but more about the bottom line of corporate America. So that, you notice, that decision was not in line with the other decisions regarding other independent boards and commissions.
And moving forward, looking at the U.S.-Iran war, and in particular the memorandum of understanding, trying to discover whether or not there is indeed a position there where if this war is going to come to an end. Our quest here is to understand the nature of the war, to understand this war itself, and the diplomacy. Is diplomacy winning, or is force still part of the application?
Well, they say they're employing diplomacy, but what we saw, every time they have a settlement, there's a disagreement about what the settlement actually means, and then wars break out. They still continue to, shoot missiles at one another. So it remains to be seen whether or not the diplomacy is actually working. In this particular case, we understand the source of the problem is nuclear ambitions, but not so much nuclear ambitions. The tentative agreement was based on a compromise in the Straits of Hormuz, and so it's about money coming through the Straits, and so this last skirmish had to do, and this is what's happening, with who controls the Straits of Hormuz, and the Iranians attacked the Singapore vessel because they subscribe to the United Nations navigational path, whereas Iran wants to dictate that themselves. So that's still why we had this skirmish. But whether diplomacy is working, to some extent, it always reminds me about Israel when you got in and said, well, the United States is not going to be involved. The United States is involved. It does have an impact one way or the other.
I cannot imagine. And I think part and parcel to the dilemma that we're being confronted with is that diplomacy is being conducted in the arena of public opinion. Exactly. And historically, if you're going to want to engage in something which is productive, diplomacy is quiet. It's in the dark. And then you bring it to public opinion when you come close. It seems as though the only one that says that makes announcements is the American side, the Trump administration, make announcements which Iranians say this is not true, this is not the case. Who do you believe? I'm of the mindset. That I put more stock in what the Iranians say than what this administration says. For one reason alone, this administration has been so loose with the truth, even with its own domestic affairs, that you cannot have you cannot give it the kind of validity and value that you should. Truth is things that from the color of the water at the reflecting pool to the size of inaugurations to all sorts of the assaults that's being done against its own citizenship. So the truth is not something of value within this administration. Yes.
And that's by design, because what's more important in this whole thing is not diplomacy, but propaganda. As you say, things being said because of public opinion. And nobody really knows what's really going on, because you can't deal with the credibility of not just the United States, but the Iranians as well.
Well, when you're dealing with that, then who wins and when?
Exactly. Well, I mean,
yes, sir.
The public doesn't win, that's for sure. But what it is what it is. We don't. There no winners in total because they have not gotten to an end game. They're still in the midst of exchanging gunfire. They're still in the midst of honoring what's been settled, what supposedly is already settled, and just knowing what's settled. So it's definitely not in the interest of the American people.
Well, for my purposes, the end game is on its way. The midterm elections are going to clearly define where America is thinking. And Yes, sir. Because I want to move on to some state and local stuff.
Well,
Yeah.
once again, that's true. Even though the Trump administration failed with respect to the birthright citizenship, there's other games that they're playing. The SAVE Act, and all of those other things are related to controlling, impacting the elections. So, that's the. But those are the major things. Now, in terms
The
of
state and local elections, because in the remaining 6 minutes or so that we have.
let me just say this about, to me, once again, the most important events that have occurred had occurred in terms of the court, the suit being filed by the judge. His name is escaping me now, who said that the legislation for terminating the courts did not meet the 2/3 threshold.
Yeah.
It didn't meet the 2/3 threshold. So, which means he's saying that the law that was passed was not legitimate. I mean, that is unbelievable. John Fuller.
Yes, right
which I thought was
here
a
in New Orleans,
brilliant
yes.
strategy, because he didn't say anything the whole time he was there. He waited to the end of his term, and now he's challenging. And I think he has sound grounds. But I always,
on appeal, the technicalities is where you win.
Yeah, well, he wants to go to the federal court, and of course, legally, I think the grounds are strong. But once again, we see that politically, the federal courts would side with the Trump administration, if they can find a alternative legal explanation.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, and of course, with the grand jury, the Orleans grand jury is exploring an indictment against the attorney general for a violation of law, and that also is very because it's a violation of law in terms of saying, and we heard these things plain as day, the intimidation of Jason Williams, the intimidation of Mayor Helena Moreno, the intimidation of all of this. So there's no doubt that there was a violation of law, but the question is, how will the federal courts decide on it? And you just don't know, or whether they would hear it, even as the Supreme Court. Are they going to hear the cases, that are coming from Louisiana, both in terms of Calvin Duncan's situation and the situation with John Fuller, which has very legitimate legal grounds. Let me just say this: the idea that a state can superimpose a discriminatory practice on one county or one parish is unconstitutional. And it not only violates the rights of those parishes, that parish or that county, but it also violates the rights of the citizens. We are at a disadvantage because of the discrimination against the people in Orleans Parish.
100, absolutely. And before we exit, this whole concept that we find that's taking place now in various elections across the country, and it is not a movement yet, or perhaps may be the beginning of a movement. But how do you look at this democratic socialism? And if you could address that before we exit today.
Well,
socialist candidates winning, socialist candidates winning.
Obviously,
in primaries, in the primaries.
Obviously, it worked in New York.
Okay.
Yes, it's going to work in New York. So we still have a variety of different states. We got extremely blue states, almost states that may be ready for democratic socialism. We have states that are democratic, and we got states that are same on the opposite end for Republicans, and we got the states that are purple. Like Maine, Colorado, different places that are not so in total. But the trend seems to be working in the favor of the Democratic Party based on the polls about the performance of this president. That's why mega party is employing all other strategies to offset what may be the inevitable. But once again, my philosophy, if you can't protect your election, you don't deserve to win. And that's what I think where we are now, because the mega party has a whole repertoire of things that they want to do to undermine. And of course, we know the formula is if Trump wins, it's a fair election. If he loses, it's not a fair election.
And that's the way it works. And your final statement before we exit today.
Well, once again, pay attention.
30 years from now, 30 days from now, yes, sir.
Pay attention to these decisions. I think the idea of John Fuller's, Justice John Fuller's, and the Orleans Parish Court and Calvin Duncan, we need to look towards that, because once again, it's the federal courts that's going to weigh in on that. And we know, for the most part, the federal courts have leaned. Oh, we didn't talk about the E. Jean Carroll situation.
Yes, sir.
So,
talk to us.
And so the idea that there was some decisions in which they actually ruled against the president is very, very enlightening and a good sign that they're not going to. I mean, if you're going to.
And with Cook, yes.
If you're going to do everything you say, then, I mean, what do you need a Supreme Court for? Who do you need justices for?
But and the final analysis, why do you need a Congress?
Why you need a Congress?
If the majority party is going to acquiesce.
And even the Republican Party has pushed back on the SAVE Act and other things. Because, I mean, this is not the Third Reich. We're not under fascism in theory, So I think he's overplaying his hand.
I agree with you 100%. And again, I want to thank you for joining me. And again, this is Dr. Clark's 101, The Living Classroom. And you can follow me on all platforms of social media. And as always, it's been a pleasure.